All right, good morning. Happy Sunday. Glad to see those of you all who are here in the room and those of you all who are joining online. I want to talk a little bit this morning together about sacraments, plural, sacrament as an idea, and sacramentality as a sort of character or quality or even disposition toward life. Of life toward life. You all have probably heard versions of this blessing. I think Sarah uses a version of it sometimes. I use a version of it sometimes. It's from a Blackrock prayer book. The world is now too dangerous and too beautiful for anything but love. May your eyes be so blessed that you see God in everyone, your ears so that you hear the cry of the poor. May your hands be so blessed that everything you touch is a sacrament. Your lips so that you speak nothing but the truth with love. May your feet be so blessed that you run to those who need you. And may your heart be so opened, so set on fire, that your love changes everything. I love this blessing as a whole, but I'm always especially moved by this part in bold. May your hands be so blessed that everything you touch is a sacrament. It's so expansive, isn't it? It sort of takes sacraments out of one particular context and explodes that box so that we're invited to experience sacramentality of life, God's grace outside of this one container, not in this container, but also outside of that container in the rest of our lives. So let's talk a little bit about sacraments, first of all. So how many sacraments do we recognize in the Episcopal tradition? Yell louder. 5, I hear 3, I hear 6. It's actually 2. The sacrament of baptism and the sacrament of communion, right? So just 2 sacraments proper that we observe in the Episcopal tradition and other sacramental Protestant traditions as well. How about in the Catholic tradition? 7, there, everybody knows that one. Can you name them? Your rector's in the room. So what are the 7 observed in the Catholic tradition? Marriage is among them. Yeah, baptism, marriage, confirmation, Eucharist, ordination, reconciliation. Yes. So we have baptism, we have confirmation, we have Eucharist, penance and reconciliation go together. Anointing of the sick, I think I heard you say that, Penny. Holy orders, I think somebody else said that too, and holy matrimony. Now, yes? Difference between ritual and the sacrament. Exactly. So in the Episcopal Church, unlike the other other sacramental Protestant traditions, we do recognize those remaining 5, but we don't call them sacraments proper. We regard them as sacramental rites, right? But yeah, I think your question, Becky, about what the difference between sacrament and ritual, what's the difference between a sacrament and a sacramental ritual or rite, is exactly the question that I want us to get at and sort of pull apart, right? Yes, Langdon.
We move on and just do a definition.
Sure.
What about the Orthodox Eastern Church?
The Orthodox Church also, I believe, is with Catholic recognizes 7. The same 7. They call the sacraments mysterion. So they refer to them as the mysteries. Which I think is really nice and helpful, right? It's sort of, there's the permission built in to not have to fully understand in order to participate, right? Because we don't ever fully understand mystery. That's the nature of mystery. But right, so in the Episcopal Church, we recognize these remaining 5 that the Catholics regard as sacraments with a capital S, if you will, but we recognize them as sacramental rites. So we affirm them as these rituals, these practices that, just like the sacraments do, recognize God's presence with us, God's relationship with us in these sacred moments and practices. And I think this distinction between sacrament and sacramental rite is instructive for the larger point that I want to make this morning, is that, you know, even though we don't call matrimony a sacrament with a capital S, for instance, we understand that God is moving and working and present with us in this sort of sacred moment. And the point that I want to make for us this morning is that sacred moments happen all the time. You know, they happen in our worship and in our religion, our life together as a community of faith, but they also happen out in the world, right? In the everyday. And so there's this, you know, we have the containers of the sacraments that have all of the language and the symbolism and the context for us. And so it's really easy to sort of recognize, here's the way that God is present to us in this container. So I want to think about what those containers are doing for us so that we can take the sort of the content out of the container and out into the rest of our lives, rest of the world with us. So while we're still on definitions, the sort of dictionary definition of a sacrament is a religious ceremony or ritual regarded as imparting divine grace, such as baptism, Eucharist, etc. The definition that we get in the Book of Common Prayer, though, that is attributed to Augustine, that many of you may know in total or may know bits and pieces of. Sacraments are outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual grace given by Christ as sure and certain means by which we receive that grace. Does anybody have, like, what does this mean? Does anybody have thoughts about what that means or feelings about what that means to you?
I think it's broader out in the world. When I walk the dog in the morning, creation.
Exactly. And it's interesting to me that the definition that the Book of Common Prayer gives us is much less specific, right? So it's broader already. Outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual grace doesn't say, and these are the ones. These are the places that you find it, right? And so the really lovely thing about our Book of Common Prayer is that it has a roominess to the theology and the language that allows so many different perspectives to inhabit it. And so my experience of communion might be different from your experience, but there's room within our tradition that we can fit ourselves under that umbrella together, even if our experience and understandings diverge a little bit from one another. And if you read a lot of the Book of Common Prayer and the language in our liturgy, it's designed that way so that there's room for all of us within it. The other thing about this definition, outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual grace given by Christ as sure and certain means by which we receive that grace, right? So we're talking about twofold character here. There's, we take the sacraments to be both the sign or the symbol, right? And the vehicle of God's grace. So the sacrament as the thing that points to God's grace, and one of the ways in which we actually experience that grace. So it's sort of, it's working in two ways in that way, right? In two directions. It's both a symbol or a sign. It both points to a thing and is also that thing, conveys that thing to us. We'll talk a few minutes, or we're going to get into it in just a few minutes about our own experience of sacrament, of that grace. And I hope at that point we can sort of unpack the difference between pointing to something and actually experiencing it for ourselves. Now let's talk about baptism first. What is the content? I've been talking about the vessel of the sacrament and the content of the vessel, right? This container and what it contains. So when we talk about baptism, what is the grace that we witness, that we receive in the sacrament? What does baptism do? And this is not a hypothetical or rhetorical question. I am inviting your thoughts on what baptism does. And if you're online and would like to chime in, please use the hand raise function. Langdon.
I'll just try to paraphrase to put the fun on him.
All right.
Part is Christ alone, something like that.
Right. Okay. So we are claimed by Christ and welcomed into God's family. What else happens during baptism? Kathy. Right, right. So another reference back to the community, right? And the grace that we find there. Absolutely. Who else? Cindy.
It's also water.
Yeah. Right, right. Yeah, it's the sort of, there's the other thing that I love about the sacraments, right, is that they are so embodied. Right? This is, if you may or may not have caught my article in Friday's Crossroads, where I talk about just the mundane, ordinary elements that we use in these sacraments, right? Bread, wine, water, they are the stuff of our everyday lives. So pointing us to the God, the incarnate God who meets us in the actual world, in our actual lives, right where we are. Sari. Exactly, right. And we think it's wild, right? Because we tend to only think about the birth, and water is a symbol of rebirth, and we're very often baptizing little babies, but it's right there in the liturgy that we die with Christ, buried with Christ, so that we can share in Christ's resurrection. I see that that's new to some people.
Yeah, it's like we're talking about a baby here. So in terms of the earlier conversation, what I noticed was a difference between, in one of those bolded sentences, that it's a vehicle to receive God's grace, and another is a vehicle for God to convey the grace. It seems to me that you have God conveying grace, but the recipient not really of an open heart or ability to receive it. So I guess this idea of dying in the baptism, I'm just not quite understanding what's happening in that moment.
Yeah.
That the baby's grappling with that.
Right. Well, that's such a good question. Thank you, Becky. And I think that, I mean, there are different ways to unpack that, interpret that theologically.
Yeah.
One way that is compelling to me is that harkening back to the sacraments as a mystery, right? As mysteries, there's this sense that there's some movement on God's part that happens in the sacrament, or as a result of the sacrament, that God is present in that way, but not necessarily that the change that happens in us doesn't necessarily have to happen in that moment. Right, and we say the same thing about in the ordination, right? There's this idea and the language of being ontologically changed, and so that can sound like God zaps us in that moment to be a new thing, right? But that sounds like a magic trick to me. The way that I experience it in my own life and have experienced, and when I was preparing for ordination, I thought, ontologically changed, like that seems like that's a big statement. But my experience has been that the change is gradual and unfolding. And that is a thing that continues to happen because of a commitment that I've made, and sort of like my own, commitment to this life it does continue to change me and to work on me. And I imagine that baptism and communion, right, work in a similar way. That it's not necessarily that in the moment when we receive the bread and the wine, something happens and now we're new, or in the moment that the baby is, is dipped in water 3 times, something happens and then now they've died and been reborn. But to Kathy's point, like as a community, we have made a commitment to them, right? And then they've, their parents have made that commitment on their behalf. And so there's this sort of gradual unfolding of the mystery of the sacrament that can happen over time, which doesn't mean that that the sacrament isn't effective. It means that, maybe our expectations can be a little too intense for God's time. Is that helpful at all? Good, thank you. Ron and then Earl.
We're gonna have to start people.
Okay.
Thank you, Sari.
I was just going to say that the word that comes to me is the choice to follow. So I grew up in a Baptist church and had full immersion baptism in very cold water when I was 12 years old. But yeah, what comes to mind is follow and embarking on a journey, kind of what you were just indicating. So anyway, that was
Awesome.
kind of the key for me.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you, Ron. I think Earl had a comment too. Thanks, Jay.
So I think the way we're talking about baptism fits well our custom of baptism of babies. But there's also adult baptism. And we witnessed that in our Anglican church in Istanbul, where a couple were baptized in our church in a very large, deep fountain. It was total immersion into it, and they rose out of it dripping wet and with radiant smiles, I must say. And one of the things that struck me was that in that country, many of the women, but not all, had some kind of head covering and sometimes a facial covering, but not most. In her case, she had taken that off and entered into this baptism, and she didn't put it back on when she arrived. And I thought, for me at least, what a liberating moment. But I wonder if you have any comments on any differences in your mind between the certainly not the sanctity, but the nature of adult baptism, what the church expects or doesn't expect beforehand with the baby, not much. Is there anything different in our ceremony and our expectations as Episcopalians, depending on whether a person is an adult or a baby?
Well, I mean, I think that the main difference, of course, is that, it's a decision, independent decision, that the adult makes. But in terms of, I'm assuming that behind your question is a question about sort of requirements on the front end or readiness for baptism. Sure, always on the back end, right? Because we've made this commitment and we're going to try to, align our lives with it in a certain respect. The thing I want to say about the front end, and not all priests or theologians would agree with me, but on the front end, for me, we practice, I'm going to refer to communion here real quickly. We practice open table communion at St. John's because for me, there's a number of reasons why we would do that. One is God's welcome. We don't want to put gates where God has simply, opened the door. But also, we don't know exactly what's going on in any other person spiritually at any given time. And so not putting those gates on the front end allows for the mysterious ways in which God does work and works differently in each of us, right? Because if God meets us where we are, Where we are is hyper individual, right? I am where I am, and it is not where Carolyn is. And so I do expect that God would work differently with this context than God would work with that context. And so not putting those sorts of really strict expectations either before or after these sacraments sort of allows the mysterious unfolding of God's movement. And for me, it's a posture of faith that God is with us and moving with us and continues to be present, and that God's will and work in us continues to unfold over time. And that, all of our journeys with that look a little different. Did I satisfy you at all? Thank you, Earl. Anything else while we're here talking about baptism? I'm going to throw up these 8 more sort of technical, theological, and when we ask the theologians, what does baptism do? Right? They would say, in baptism, we are participating in Christ's death and resurrection, that there is a conversion, a pardoning, a cleansing that happens in baptism, that it conveys the gift of the Spirit that Christ promised us, that the Spirit will always be with us. As we said, it incorporates us into the body of Christ universal. This marked with the sign of God's kingdom, marked as Christ's own. Forgiveness of sins, there's a sort of regeneration into new life, this newness, which also comes with it a call to service. And then, so we talked about incorporation into body of Christ universal, and then also the incorporation into a local community of faith. Is there anything up here in this list that is confusing or that you want to offer question or comment on? Okay, let's go on to the Eucharist. What's the content here? What is the grace that we witness in communion? What does the Eucharist do? What does it symbolize? What does it point us toward? Anybody?
I think it nourishes us.
Mm.
The way food I'm sorry. Thanks, Jay. In the way food nourishes our body and keeps us alive, I think the sacrament of Eucharist nourishes our spirits and keeps us alive in that way.
Spiritual food, as we say. Nice. Thank you, John. Who else? Langdon.
I usually use the term communion rather than Eucharist because the community is implied in the word communion.
Yes.
And it connects me to those that are immediately around me taking communion, but also through time and space to others that have been doing this for centuries and around the world, more or less at the same time I'm doing it on a Sunday morning.
Absolutely. I love that. Yes, thank you. And then communion with God as well, right? Carolyn.
I remember my husband, who was an Episcopal priest, always called it a celebration and a party. Come to the party. It's that simple. That's all I have to say.
A celebration, an invitation to the party. I love that. I love that. Ron.
I think that it's, for me, it nourishes commitment because, at least speaking for myself, otherwise I kind of drift and it's like, okay, this is a commitment to yourself, to your faith, to walking with God. So.
Nice. Yeah. I grew up in a tradition that didn't celebrate communion every week, but monthly. And I really appreciate that in the Episcopal Church, we do it weekly for that reason, right? That there is this sort of commitment. We have the opportunity to be reminded of the party to which we're invited, of the community to which we belong, to God's, nourishment of us. over and over and continually, right? And that we get the chance to be reminded of that every week. Yeah, thank you.
Comment from Jenny.
Yes, thank you, Jenny. I'm trying to do that better now. Thank you for the reminder.
No.
And yes, the communion refreshes and reminds us of our union with Christ and our call to discipleship. Beautiful. Thank you, Jenny. I think I saw another hand. Yes. Kathy has her hand up, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you.
Every week when I take communion, I'm reminded of taught Eucharist that I did with Dwayne Alvord and the children. And when we were ready to give the host, Dwayne said, "Do you know what this is?" And this 3-year-old said, "Jesus." And I thought, right on, you got it, you got it. And that's what it means to me each time I share in the Eucharist with you or Sari or whoever, that I'm right there with Jesus.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Kathy. Anybody else on this in the room or online while we're talking about what happens at communion?
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
And I haven't actually thought about the answer to this yet. But sometimes we have people who come to St. John's who are not Christian, and because we practice an open table, say all are welcome. And they'll come forward and they'll receive communion, but they're not Christian and they're not necessarily looking to convert.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, yes, a sacrament is an outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. But could it also just be, if somebody's not willing to receive that, can it also just be a sign, but the grace doesn't come with it? Or when someone takes communion, is Jesus like, are they becoming Christian basically, like without knowing it? You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes it's just a thing without the thing behind it,
Well,
depending on whether I don't know. You see where the question is?
yeah.
And I don't know the answer to it. I could process it with you, but I'm curious what you think about it.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's interesting. My immediate reaction is that just because the person who receives communion doesn't feel the grace of God doesn't mean that grace isn't there. And I wouldn't say that you're converting because you partake, but I also wouldn't say that, I also don't think the sacrament is cheapened in any way when people who are not Christian or not converting partake in it, because God's grace, it isn't like I don't understand God to withhold God's grace unless you like get on board in the exact way that I want you to, and so for me, I would say it's still the sacrament, even if the person isn't experiencing it in the way that we think it is to be experienced. Earl and then Cindy. Oh, no, we've got something thank you. Kevin says, it seems to me it's a physical tie to a spiritual reality. Nice. They exist in union. By taking a physical act, I bring my being to a spiritual reality that recognizes that both are real, tied, and function together. I love that, Kevin, and I especially love how incarnational that is, right? I would say exactly, because to be a human in the world is sort of that union of the spiritual reality and the physical reality, and that's exactly what the sacraments point us to over and over again. Earl.
Thanks for the question, Sari. My answer is, whose communion is it? Is it our communion? If so, we can make the rules. But if it's God's communion, like it's God's dirt and God's talents, hearkening back to a sermon I heard somewhat recently, then it's not really up to us to decide who is worthy and who isn't. God's love, we believe, is open to everybody, think of ourselves as instrumentalities, not rule makers or judges. And I think it gets a lot simpler.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And that's one of the ways in which we remain, I'm going to come and bring the mic up. We remain open to God's mystery in that way, right? That we don't have to know everything. That's an act of faith and trust to say, you know, God is in this and you're welcome to it.
And also as to Sarah's question, it occurred to me, communion is like I said, for the community. So even if the individual taking communion, taking Eucharist, doesn't necessarily believe it's the community around that person that is upholding all of us. So in a way, that's part of the sacrament to me.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Penny.
So if I'm in the pew and I don't believe where we are and I'm invited to come to communion and I come, isn't that God working that way? Isn't that a
think so.
calling? Whether I know it or not, that I'm opening myself up to a possibility that might be there.
I think so. I absolutely think so. Yeah. You know, I'll redirect us back to mystery again and again. We can't know all of the things that we would like to know. And so, yeah, I think that when we allow our worship life, our faith life in community to not be so defined and circumscribed, we can allow, you know, the room for God to work and you know, the understanding that we might not know everything about what that looks like. Yeah, thank you. Becky, did you have your hand up?
Because I just can't help myself. I know this will be heretical. That's the right one. So when Sarah asked that question, I was sort of interested in all the qualifications he put on it. Someone who comes up who's not Christian, or someone who's comes up, because frankly, for me, that sacrament does not mean a lot to me. I don't feel the conveyance of God's grace. And I believe 100% that God's grace is always available through whatever vehicle we're able to receive it. So that was kind of my question about the receiving, and what I'm finding to be the most meaningful thing now, and this is actually as a result of COVID, is receiving the blessing. And there's something more tangible and real and connecting for me to feel the cross with the thumbprint and the oil. And I feel the blessing, whoever's giving it. And I think mostly I have direct eye contact. So over and over again, when we talk about these sacraments, to me, the ones that convey the most, that I can receive the most grace, is when I feel seen. And when you ask that question about baptism, like I just pictured Sarah in all the baptisms I've seen, looking deeply and intently at the face of this baby, whether they're crying or not. And I can't help but feel that baby in some way knows it's seen. And even to Kathy's point, that as a congregation, we're seeing the reception and the incarnation. And I think with Christmas, that whole thing of the dying. But anyway, I just wanted to, you said this, Sarah, and it's true, that God's grace is always flowing. And so when we can't receive it, it's not that God's grace isn't flowing. It's just we can't do anything with it. So what we can receive, we can pass on. Really a lot to your sermon, John, right? What we receive, it's up to us to pass it on. And we have to receive it first.
Nice. Yeah, yeah. Oh, great. Let's see. Jenny, let's get you unmuted. You go ahead.
First to what Becky said, I know that when I will come back physically into the building of the church, that I will want a blessing and not the sacrament. I think that I agree with her. There's, I just feel strongly that the blessing is what I need. The sacrament is important to me, but it's the blessing that I would need. I wanted first to respond to what Sari's question. At my wedding, my matron of honor is Jewish, and I knew that. And I had communion at my wedding, and I knew that she knew what was involved with communion, and I appreciated that she took communion. Not that I was expecting her to become Christian, but that she was acknowledging the unity of being with us at the wedding. And so I appreciated her doing it. I also know that there are times when those of us who are baptized and are quote Christian don't come to the table with our hearts open. And so even those who go to the table that are officially Christian don't necessarily come to the table with their hearts and minds set to receive it, but yet they still do. And it can, by doing so, it can open them up to be reset into the right position, mentally and spiritually. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It does make sense. I absolutely agree with you. You know, we don't always know what's going on in other people, and we also don't know what God is doing with it. And so, yeah, I agree with you, Jenny, that you can be sort of not in the right place to receive communion, and that might be one of the things that communion, one of the ways that God's grace moves through that sacrament to you. You know, one of the ways that we can be transformed together. You know, Jenny and Becky, you just launched us toward the next thing that I want to talk about, actually, which is that, you know, so if the sacraments are pointing us toward God's grace that is already bestowed, right? We're saying that God's grace is already moving, and the sacraments are pointing us toward it. Perhaps the more important action that happens is the one that happens within us. So what I want to talk about is what happens within us when we experience sacraments or the sacramental. Both Jenny and Becky mentioned receiving a blessing, which I would say is a sacramental. There's a sacramentality to that, right? It's not a sacrament, although it is happening within the container of the sacrament in the instance of the Eucharist. But there's a sacramentality that's sort of extra sacramental, if you will, in, say, a blessing. So the question for the group is, what do sacraments do within us? What feelings do you experience? When you participate in a sacrament, you know, in church, whether it's communion, whether it's witnessing the baptism of a baby, whether it was the baptism of your own child, your own baptism, if you remember that. Talk to me about the feelings that happen in you, in your experience of the sacraments. Carolyn.
Thanks. For me, it's a call to action. It's always a call to action. Get out there, do something that needs to be done with others in a myriad of ways. And St. John's is so good at having such a myriad of ways to act and respond to that call.
What is it in the sacrament that calls you to action?
Something within. It's something I can be sort of intellectual about. It's also something that is a feeling that is sort of ineffable. Yeah. That just beckons me to move forward. And I fail too often. I have to accept myself for that, but it's a call to action.
Nice, nice.
Is that enough? Yeah.
I'm hearing you say that this feeling, right, is that maybe in this container, the grace is the nudge outward. You know, the movement of God's grace is the way that it nudges us toward other people to service and action. Beverly, for me, the sacraments are ways that we open ourselves to connection with God, who is always there waiting for us, but we need to keep reconnecting. I think the invitation to open communion says something like it's open to all who are seeking God. Thank you, Beverly. Yeah, the sort of, yeah, exactly. The nudge to reconnect over and over again too, right? That we aren't in a vacuum. We belong to one another and we belong to God, and God is always there to remind us of that. Barbara.
I have to echo Carolyn, but add something else. And that is the grace that we get in baptism always calls us to do something with love. Because this church, as Penny pointed out in the Crossroads, does many, many things. But I can tell you from going to those meetings that every person is doing that with love. And I myself feel rededicated every Sunday to doing more with love.
So there's also the feeling of being encouraged in your faith to live in this certain way, right? To embody God's love. Becky.
So I first came to church at a 5 o'clock service and saw Sari preached. And within the first month, maybe it was the next Sunday, I went to the morning service and Sari did a Rite 13 passage. And I think I went up to you that day and said, I want that. Like there was, and that was partly my question of ritual versus sacrament. Like I wanted that. And Sari said, that's not for you, but you can be confirmed. And he actually ran a class that spring, I think, and I did it. And I just want to say it was one of the most powerful experiences. And what I felt most clearly was belonging. It was a mark and a commitment, and really to even what Carolyn was saying. It was an outward acceptance that I was part of this group, didn't know half the people at the church at the time, but I knew that I was part of something bigger than me, with God as its center focus and lead. And it called forth some way of contributing or offering what I could. And so it was really powerful. So anyway, I even if I don't get much out of the Eucharist, like that was killer. Yeah. And other, of course, sacraments, but.
Right. Well,
Sorry.
yeah.
I've got something to
Please.
I'm starting to think that there's some people who value sacraments that have nothing to do with other people. Like people who want the thing without any interruption from human beings. And then there are others who actually they feel much more connected to the face-to-face, the person who touches you and is talking to you. So, and I feel in my ministry, I've experienced that. There are people who like would prefer the priest to be speaking and giving them the sign, that feels more sacred. And there are others who are like, would be happy if there was no one in the room except just the hand that gives the communion. It's just a direct feeling that it's you and God. So.
No, I love that because that really highlights the sort of the variety that we can all feel within, this same container, that we are all, because we are all different, we experience the same thing in our unique way. Right? Okay, you've seen that one. Thank you, Sari. My next question is, where else do you experience similar feelings? Probably not, like if you think about the feeling you have at communion or when we baptize a baby or in any of these other contexts that we're talking about, sacramental rites or within this sort of spiritual context that we share together. Where else do you have those feelings? Is that a hand, Kathy?
Whenever I feel joy,
Mm,
I have the same feeling, whether it's because my grandchild just did something miraculous, like saying, I love you, Gigi, or just seeing a sunset.
yeah.
It all depends. It can be with others. It can be alone. But whenever I feel that deep sense of joy, that's when I feel the same.
Nice, nice. Yeah, and it sounds like whether we're talking about a sunset or a grandchild, right? That joy is the result of feeling like God is present in that moment in some way, right? Yeah. Ginny, go ahead.
I just was reminded, or I'm constantly reminded of during the pilgrimage in 2016 with Sari, we went to the riverbank of the Jordan River and we reaffirmed our baptism. So we weren't doing a sacrament per se because we weren't being baptized. We weren't having communion, but we said the words of reaffirming our baptism. And as we came up from the riverbank, Sari blessed each of us. And I was standing behind Sari, and I was photographing the people as they came to be blessed. And it was very, very clear that we were all feeling, it was very spiritual, and we all were feeling, I really think we all were feeling the sacramentality of that moment. There was definitely a sense of grace in that moment.
Nice, nice. Yeah, full of God, that moment. Beautiful. Thank you. Langdon.
So Kathy's comment about joy made me think of something. And that is, I feel a sacramental connection to grace, also in pain and sorrow.
Yeah.
And I've recently learned that, I guess, Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, had a phrase that when you go into Jordan to be baptized, you come out with a lot of mud.
Nice.
It's an immersion in life, both the joy and the muck, and also the service. Like, it's a call to participate in life and all its joy and its muck.
Yeah. So beautifully put. So beautifully put, right? It's the fullness of it, right? The messy both and of all of the good stuff and all of the hard stuff. That's the most incarnational thing I can think of, right? And God's promise is that God meets us in all of it. Yeah, all of it. Just the sorrow is just as full with God as the joy, if we know how to look for it there.
I want to mention the healing rite too, which is a sacramental rite, one that I really appreciate. So I'm glad that's back and available here. Means a lot to me.
Thank you, Cindy.
Being a nature lover, I love looking at seed pods this time of the year, especially, and looking at the possibilities and the way nature bundles up these seeds in such exquisite, infinite possibilities. And so it represents growth and life and possibility and hope.
Nice.
And hope and some predictability that's reassuring and fills me with wonder.
Yeah, there's some sort of sacramentality available just in the rhythms of the natural world, right? You see sort of the rebirth, the death and rebirth, and God's movement through all of it. It's beautiful. Sari, did you have a comment?
Yeah, actually a question. I'm just wrestling with this for a second. If the Episcopal Church recognizes really only two sacraments, right? And baptism is a one-time thing, right? You're only adopted once. that means there's only one thing,
Mhm.
which feels so odd to me for the Episcopal Church to narrow down something that is so needed in the world, which is God's grace, that we would have narrowed it down. And I know it didn't just start. I mean, I get that, like, for Episcopalians, the reason we only go with two is because those are the ones in the Gospels that we see that Jesus did, you know? So, but even the other seven, you know, I mean, all of them, the seven, they're still just, they are moments, right, where things happen. And I feel like that's so limiting when I think of Jesus saying, like, where two or more are gathered, I am with you. That for me feels like that's grace among us, or where Jesus says, I'm with you to the end of the age. And I don't know why, because I hear what you're saying and the questions that you're asking, like, where else have we felt this?
Yeah.
You're trying to open us up to think that actually there are sacraments that are happening everywhere. In our inner encounter with the holy and the divine is not just in a single moment on a Sunday morning. That feels so, makes life feel so like absent of the space of grace. So I'm really curious why we've tolerated for so long this idea that grace comes to us in these two symbols or these signs. Whereas I kind of want to open this whole thing up and define it very, very differently about where we experience the inward and spiritual grace and where it comes to us. So
Yeah.
this is a very stimulating conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. You know, like, obviously I'm with you on that, but I interpret the 2 verses 7 a little bit differently than you do. You know, you're holding up the, you know, the one communion as the one that's available to all of us over and over and over again. I think that's much more expansive than saying God is in these 7 containers, right? Instead, we're saying, like, here are 2 like really holy containers. This one is available to everyone all the time. This one is available to everyone. But, you know, instead of saying, like, it has to look these ways, right? I think it's much more expansive to have a, like, sort of arch symbol, and then, you know, this sort of recognition of the sacrament. We have sacramental rites, right? And that language that we're talking about that recognizes God's movement in these rites sort of gestures to the fact that it doesn't have to be a sacrament proper in order for it to contain God's grace, right? That, like, there's actually something broader at work here. So I actually think it feels more expansive not to have these 7 that are codified, but instead to have this language of God is moving through all of these other things too, because that sort of gives us a doorway into God's movement outside of our containers. And Jenny says, but the other 5 sacraments are exclusionary in aspect. Marriage is not necessarily for all. Priesthood, death officially comes just once. Yeah, I think, Jenny, you're sort of on the same page that I'm trying to get at with that as well. There is a sort of restriction that happens when we say, well, it's these 7 containers look this way, in my opinion. John.
Yeah, I think the churches, the Episcopal Church has talked about the 2 main sacraments, but then the 5 lesser sacraments. And I guess I sort of look at this in the way of teaching. The sacraments are a way, like we teach our children things. These are concrete examples of how this is. But this morning, during communion, I was sitting there. I wasn't a part of that, and neither was Sari. And we were singing a hymn, and Sari's a real musician. And Mary doesn't like to sit next to me in church because I like to sing, but she says, you throw me off. And yet here, Sari was singing and I was joining with him in singing, and he didn't seem to mind that. But that was, to me, that was sacramental. That was grace. I sort of felt like, oh, I'm at home. I can do this.
Nice.
So I think these 7 sacraments are a way we teach about how we find grace in so many other things.
Yeah. Thank you for making the point I'm trying to make so beautifully and concisely. Exactly. Exactly. I do want to plug serving as a limb. We're talking about the feeling of receiving communion. And I think that John and the rest of the clergy in here and anybody else who serves as a limb in here can attest that there's something really profound and humbling and poignant in experiencing that from the other side, from the side of service as well. So, you know, there is the feeling and the experience of receiving the sacrament. There's also a fullness and just a real profundity in being on the other side, on the serving side of administering the sacrament. And so I would just invite you, if you're interested, in a lay Eucharistic minister. The limbs are those who serve communion, serve the wine at the altar during communion.
And we're always happy to have you enjoy.
Exactly. I'm going to skip a couple of slides here because we're running out of time. And I want to talk about a couple of examples of extra sacramental sacraments. I used to serve a church before coming to St. John's, Thad's Church in LA, which is an Episcopal church technically, but not recognizably. They did not celebrate communion weekly, monthly only, so that was not their central sacrament. What was their central sacrament was a sacred conversation, sacred discussion that they had right in the middle of service, after the sermon, kind of like we're doing here, passing the mic, talking about the sermon, the scripture, and where that intersected their lives. And they didn't necessarily talk about it as their central sacrament, but after being a part of that community for several years, I realized that that's exactly what it was, what it is that this is their outward and visible sign of that inward and spiritual grace. And part of the proof in the pudding, if you will, of that was that those conversations were so honest and so vulnerable and authentic. And that was sort of like the sign of that grace that they felt together, that there was this sort of, grace for everybody to bring exactly who they were and what they were going through, into conversation with one another and with God every Sunday. And so, I observed that was really the sacrament in that community. Becky, yes.
So
I can't let you say that and not thank you for bringing a form of that to St. John's. And just as you said in the Crossroads, our Monday evening discussions, that happens even on Zoom, that your facilitation and leadership, that the conversations are rich, and there's something like, it's so interesting to hear you did that on Sundays, like just the day after, even having a day to let that percolate and to come together as a group and talk about what we read and what we heard has been so rich and meaningful. And I just want to thank you, Sarah, for bringing that and you to here.
Thank you, Becky. Those Monday nights are always so rich. And if you don't join us on Monday nights, you should consider it and sign on tomorrow night at Zoom. Tomorrow night at 7 on Zoom, because it is a sacramental space, isn't it? Yeah. This one will make rhetorical. We're running out of time, but where at St. John's have you experienced similar extra sacramental sacrament? Right? Think about that, where you might have experienced it outside the sacraments. Definitely at the finance committee meetings, I'm sure. And then I know we're past time, but I want to give you one more example. This one's from William Stringfellow. He writes, and William Stringfellow was an Episcopalian, a lay theologian, and a lawyer. He served in Harlem for much of his career. He writes, I had gone out in the afternoon when it was warmer, dressed only in a shirt, chinos, and sneakers. But now that the weather had changed, I was shivering from the cold. About 2 blocks from my tenement, a boy I knew who had been loafing on the corner called out that he wanted to ask me something. As we talked, he saw that I was freezing to death, and so he took off his jacket and gave it to me to wear. The boy is an addict, and I happen to know that the clothes on his back were virtually the only ones he had. He had pawned everything else. Sometimes when his clothes were being laundered, he would have to stay in the house because he had nothing else to wear unless he could borrow something from someone. But he saw that I was cold and gave me his jacket. That is what is known as a sacrament. Amen. So the question for that is, where in your day-to-day life outside of the church have you experienced sacrament, this sort of extra sacrament, sacramentality? And then finally, in closing, just the invitation to carry this with you as sort of a spiritual practice, right? How do we cultivate a sacramental worldview? How can we be intentional about reframing the mundane, the ordinary, the automatic, sometimes the sorrowful happenings of our day-to-day lives through this lens of God's grace, always available, always at work? Whether you do it in the moment or as the end-of-day journaling discipline, you might ask, where is God in this interaction, this event, this practice? Where do I see grace? How does this moment, this person, this interaction point me back toward my faith? How can I inhabit this moment in a sacramental way? And we think of Lent as the season of spiritual disciplines, but Advent is the season of incarnation, right? When we anticipate God's coming in the world, where you're meeting us where we are, which is what sacrament is too. And so Advent begins 2 weeks from today. So I'm giving you a head start on an Advent spiritual discipline. And if anybody does do it, I would love to hear how it goes for you. Guys, I'm sorry to run over, but thank you so much for being here and participating, for all your good questions and discussion. I can make the slides available. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome.